welcome Pastor Bews, and the pulpit is all yours.
Thank you.
This time without interruptions.
I don't mind interruptions, actually. It gives you a chance to kind of think, doesn't it, really? It's always a bonus in everything, isn't there? Well, nearly everything. You've read the verse, but it might be good to open your Bibles up to Matthew chapter 14 and verses 30 to 31. And while you do, for those who don't know me, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, because that's what George suggested I ought to do. I think most of you know who I am. I've been here for nearly 6 years now. It's hard to believe, isn't it? 6 years in Adelaide. Who'd have thought? Coming from New Zealand, it's a long way to Adelaide. Although Adelaide is a lot like where I grew up in New Zealand. It has the same kind of cadence, if that's the right word. It's the same kind of style, except the temperatures are like just ridiculously different. So a hot day in New Zealand is 30 degrees, you know. And of course, New Zealand has humidity, so the humidity will be about 90%, and so it's hot and it's stinky because it's subtropical. You know, a hot day here is what, 40 something, isn't it? You know, I don't like those days. They don't do it for me. And then cold days here. Well, cold here, it's, I don't know, I've almost forgotten, but it's not that different really. In where I grew up in New Zealand in Whangarei, the numbers never really got much below about 7 or 8 degrees in the winter. So that's about the same here, isn't it, really? So, yeah, so all in all, I feel pretty much comfortable here 9-10 months of the year. And there's a couple of months where I sort of not so happy Jan, but it's still a great place to live, and we really like it. And we're glad to be here. So my number one son, Alexander's come along with me this morning to be my loyal support, which is very nice. And the girls are having a holiday at home because church doesn't start at Paravista till next weekend. So we're still just doing the live streaming. And I got a note from Glendon today saying it all went well because they tried to do something a little bit different. So that's what they normally do. But let's have a look at Matthew chapter 14 and verses 30 to 31. And it says, and when he saw the strong wind, notice he sees the wind. How do you see the wind? That's a strange. You know, if I had written Matthew, I'd have said, and when he saw the waves and the cresting and the water splashing and all, I'd have said stuff like that. But no, the Bible says, and when he saw the strong wind, that's something for you to think about. He was frightened and began to sink. You know, when I was a kid, I used to get to do the scripture reading sometime in Whangarei at church. And I'd get up there and I would woodenly read it. You know, you just read it. No, not too much intonation in the voice, not too much modulation. And I would read, but when he saw the strong wind, he was frightened and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. It's kind of, doesn't really work, does it really? Save me, Lord, he shouted. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Now, this is the sentence that I often wonder how we should read out loud. You know, you of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Was it like that? Or, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Was it like that? And I always imagine that he said it in front of all the other disciples. But in actual fact, if you read the text really carefully, they're still out on the water. So he doesn't, when Jesus reminds him that he's got little faith, he doesn't do it in front of everybody else and embarrass him. He just does it on the quiet with him. So I think, remember the storm's going crazy, right? I reckon he probably said, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? You knew I was good for you. You knew I was good for it. Why didn't you just trust me? You're going so well. You know, you were perambulating across the water. It was all looking so good. There was no trouble. There was no problem for you. You were doing it extraordinarily well. And suddenly you're sinking. Where did your faith go? You've been doing so good. You failed. Not getting it right. Failing. Doesn't seem to be such a big deal. I always forget this bit when we're small. Here are the parents encouraging their daughter. Can you see it on the screen? You know, if you're an uncle or an auntie or whatever, or a grandparent or a parent, you've all been involved in this kind of scene, haven't you? And it's all very exciting. Kids trying to totter along on their little steps, right? They're doing the very best that they can. And when you start, you're not too far apart from the other adult on the other side, right? So the kid only has to totter over a few steps and they've made it, right? Very little chance of them falling down, because you want to encourage them, don't you? You want to think that they're succeeding, that they're making the grade, that they're walking, it's going okay. That's why you keep nice and close. But as they sort of stagger a little bit less, you start to move further apart, right? And as you move further apart, what happens? Inevitably, the child falls. Now, you don't go up to the child and say, "You dreadful little failure. You are hopeless. I don't even know why you even bother to try. Maybe you should just go and sit over on the seat there and don't even bother to try again, because really you're clearly no good at this. No one's ever going to ask you to do it again." You don't say that, do you? You go, "Upsy daisy, We'll give it another wee go. Didn't you do well? There we go. We'll dust your knees off and we'll have another try." That's what happens, isn't it? That's okay. Come on, let's have another go. And there's always a hug or a cuddle involved, isn't there? "You did really well. It's all good." Alexander can't remember all this, but I remember him doing all that. And then what happens? The child doesn't worry that it fell over. And by there's soft carpet, it's all okay, And so they have another go. And when they've walked across, you all go, "Oh, you did so well. Isn't that great?" And the kid beams, just like you're doing. Big smile across their face, because that's how it works when you're learning to do the walking thing, right? And little failures along the way, doesn't matter. It's just all part of the learning, isn't it? When we're older, though, we don't do that. If we screw up or we make a mistake, we hide it, or we diminish its significance. Yeah, that's what we do. "Oh, well, it wasn't so big. If I just kept my mouth a little bit more shut, it would have been much better if I hadn't said that last sentence." It was only one sentence, mind you. If I just stuck with the other half a dozen, I'd have been okay. So, 6 out of, 1 isn't so bad. So we diminish it, or we mitigate it, yeah? We mitigate our failures, or we don't talk about them at all. We just pretend that they never happened. All that said, there is a question we could ask ourselves, and it's this one. Why do some people handle failure better than others? Why does failure paralyze some people but reignite others? And if you haven't had significant failure in your life, then it's likely you haven't probably tried hard enough. Or the good news for you, if you've been from success to success to success, is that failure is coming your way. It inevitably comes to us all. It's just life. Because everyone fails. But the real question is not how do I avoid failing? The real question is how do I handle failure when it turns up? Oh, here we go. I forgot that they disappear. Right. You know this chap? What's Thomas Edison famous for? Alexander, you've heard this before, you know. Inventing the light bulb, that's right. Thomas Edison's teachers said he was too stupid to learn anything when he was a little boy. We sit there and we go, man, that guy was uber clever. How could they possibly say he was too stupid to learn anything? Obviously, they weren't very good teachers, yeah? He was fired from his first 2 jobs for being non-productive. I can sort of understand that. His brain was probably thinking about all sorts of ideas that he had. He wasn't too focused on whatever it was that he was doing. I have this sneaking suspicion he was a typesetter. But I'm not 100% sure, so don't quote me on that. As an inventor, Edison made 1,000 unsuccessful attempts at inventing the light bulb. When a reporter asked, how did it feel to fail 1,000 times, Edison replied, I didn't fail 1,000 times. The light bulb was an invention with 1,000 steps. Recognize these 2 blokes. You should know who the guy on the left is. The other guy is the other bloke who helped start Apple Computers, Steve Wozniak. I probably mispronounced his name, but anyway. There you go. I thought he might be Polish. Yeah, when I came, I thought, I bet that's a Polish name. Anyway, not to worry. Anyway, they went to Atari and Hewlett-Packard to see if they were interested in acquiring their first personal computer that they made. Wouldn't that have changed things for Atari? I don't even think Atari exists anymore, does it? I certainly haven't heard of them for a long time. Anyway, Steve Jobs says, we went to Atari and said, hey, we've got this amazing thing, even built it with some of your parts. And what do you think about funding us? Or if you like, we'll just give it to you and you can pay us a salary and we'll work for you. And Atari, in one of those great incisive moments of intellectual wisdom and capacity, said no. So then they went to Hewlett-Packard and gave them the same offer. And Hewlett-Packard said, hey, we don't need you. You haven't even got through college yet. Because, of course, if you know the history, Steve Jobs and Steve, can you say it again for me, George? Wozniak, they did it all in the garage, right at home. That's how it all started. Now, you'll all know this bloke. In my not so humble opinion, I think he's the greatest basketball player that's ever played the game, although some would disagree. They would say that guy that just got killed in the plane crash recently was better, but I don't know. I think he's the best. But we'll say one of the greatest basketball players, just to be safe, yeah? One of the greatest basketball players of all time said, I've missed 9,000 shots in my career. Imagine knowing how many shots you missed for the number of years that he played. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted with taking the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And here comes the kicker. That is why I succeed. What's our problem with failure? The key to success, they say, is hanging in, keeping on going, because the reality of life is people who hang in and keep on going eventually get to the finish line. And if you get to the finish line, you've succeeded, yeah, haven't you? When Peter began to sink under the waves in the face of the strong wind, he didn't go, oh, well, I gave it a try and it didn't work out. Never mind, glug, 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 glug. He didn't say, well, it was fine while it lasted. You know, I really enjoyed that walking on the water thing, but I guess it all had to come to an end. Everything always does, and failure is inevitable, so, oh, well. There we go. Because you couldn't say better luck next time, because when you're sinking under the water, there really is not going to be a next time, particularly if it's in a storm when the wave tops are being whipped. Yeah. He didn't do any of those silly things. He cried out, Lord, save me. Why did he do that? Why did he cry out, Lord, save me? Well, obviously because he was sinking. I mean, that's a given, isn't it? If you're sinking, we've all been taught, yeah, when you go to the beach, you swim between the flags, right? And if you get into trouble, you raise your hand. I'm sure Peter raised his hand. So he's sinking in the water. That's why he calls out, Lord, save me. And also, I think the other reason he called out, Lord, save me, was because he wanted to walk on the water with Jesus again. Can you imagine what that would be like? Walking on the water. The only things that walk on the water are insects, right? The rest of us are just too weighty, we fall through the film. But imagine walking on the water. But even more than that, imagine walking on the water with Jesus, because that's really what the most exciting part of the equation was, wasn't it? He was walking not by himself, but he was walking towards Jesus. If you're sinking and you've been doing that, naturally you'd want to do it again. Yeah, Jesus chided him about his faith and his doubt. But he didn't do it in front of everyone else. He did it while he was lifting him up out of the water so they could stand on the water side by side and walk back to the boat. That's why he did it. And remember all the time, the wind is blowing, the waves are crashing, and there's no peace until together they've walked to the side of the boat and stepped over the gunwale. Peter's story of failure and trying again is a short one, although I am sure at the time it seemed to be a very long one. You know, always time slows down when things are going wrong. I'm sure time moved very slowly as he raised his hand from beneath the waves and cried out. But what about when failure goes on for a significant length of time? Okay, let's imagine that Peter's was what? 30 seconds maybe? 30 seconds of thrashing around in the water trying to figure out what was going to happen next and calling out for Jesus to come and rescue him. But what about when failure goes on for a long time? John Ortberg, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. I hope you have. He's really good. He wrote a book about all this. It's called If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat, which makes sense. You can't walk on the water if you're in the boat. I guess you can float on the water, but you certainly can't walk. And in this book, he notes the story of King David, but not King David as king, but David before he becomes king. Now, the problem with all these Bible stories is that if you're like me, and I suspect most of you are, you kind of know the end. And when you know the end, you kind of read the story in a way that sort of reduces the significance of the losses and elevates the significance of the wins, particularly when you know that he's going to win in the long run. Like if David was a complete and utter failure, maybe you'd do it the other way around. But we all know that in the end he wins, right? Sort of. And that's a problem, because when you're reading your way through the failures, you kind of forget them a little bit along the way. And like I say, you mitigate them in your own mind. But the truth is that if you're living with him, then that's not how it works. When you hit the wall and the failures come rocking in, you're really living those failures. You're not going, yeah, but I'll be king in a while and I'll have, 7 wives and countless numbers of children, or whatever it was that he had, You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about the fact that you're hitting the wall and it's all going very badly. So when you start the story of David, it's a great story. It's a great story of success. He goes from success to success to success. So what was his first job, people? Yeah, he was a shepherd boy, that's right. And so when he was the shepherd boy, what were the two big things that what was the thing he succeeded at looking after the sheep, but what were the two big success stories that stick out? Alexander. He killed a bear and he killed a lion. If you're the shepherd boy, that's something to write home about, isn't it? Oh, yeah, hi, Dad. Yeah, we had a good day today looking after the sheep. Yes, all 100 of them are still there. Didn't lose one, didn't have to go leave them on the hills and go looking, the 90 on the hill and go looking for the extra one. Yes, they're all still there. And, oh, by the way, I killed a bear. Oh, good. The father wouldn't go, well, good work, son. I kind of expected that. He'd go, that's excellent. Well done. That's very successful sheep looking aftering. Yeah, that's what he would do, yeah? That's how it would work. Like my English, it's pretty good. It took 2 degrees to get that. Okay, so sheep looking aftering. He's doing a great job. So he kills the lion, he kills the bear. And then his father thinks, well, he's a very responsible young man. I'll get him to take some food down to my other sons who are in King Saul's army dealing with those jolly, pesky Philistines. So, I don't know, he gets the cart and the donkey or whatever it was they used, and they put the food on the back, and off they head off out to where King Saul and his army are doing very little because they're all scared of the Philistines, right? And you would be too. Because the reality was the Philistines had a technological advantage over the Israelites. They had steel, and the Israelites are still dealing with bronze. I believe that's what I've been told. If you read very carefully in the Bible, it says that Jonathan and Saul were the only ones who had, steel swords. So I guess everyone else had bronze ones. You can imagine what that would have done to you, eh? You would not do too well. A couple of shots and you'd be over it. So they had the technological advantage, the Philistines, and they wouldn't let... In fact, if you read a bit more carefully, when it came to dealing with their farming implements, they had to go to the Philistines to get them repaired at some stages of Israelite history. So they were under control. So it was a very difficult thing to fight the Philistines. The fact was, as a general rule, you probably ought to have been on a hiding to nothing. But of course, as you read the Bible, you know that the Israelites had much success against them. Anyway, so he's off down to see his brothers who are in King Saul's army. He's taking some food from Bethlehem, which of course means house of bread. So obviously they had plenty of food in Bethlehem. And he's taking it to his brothers. And on the way, he gets there, And as he's looking around thinking, what the devil are they all doing hiding in the holes? Why aren't they out there dealing to these rotten Philistines? He sees the reason for the problem. And that, of course, is Goliath. Where does Goliath come from? Goliath of Gath, right? Okay, so Goliath comes out and tells he's going to feed their flesh to the birds of the air and all the rest of it, and that their God is no good. And David is fuming because he had so much success in his life. And this is just another lion, another bear to deal with, right? That's his way of thinking of it. Maybe he's too young to appreciate the full significance of the danger that he's in. And so he gets to meet the king, right? And he says to the king, I'll deal with this bloke. And the king probably looked and thought, you're a scrawny youth. What on earth could you possibly do? You're far too young. These are all the things that one imagine goes on in the backstory, right? You couldn't possibly organise a way to deal with that man. He's, 12 feet tall. He's enormous, He's just too big for you to deal with. You're just a young man. You couldn't possibly do it. But in the end, there aren't any other volunteers, are there? And so David goes and deals with Goliath, not in King Saul's armour, but with a sling. No wonder Goliath was insulted. No wonder he was upset. And so then, of course, David has success, doesn't he? So he changes his job. He goes from head shepherd boy to warrior musician in the court of King Saul. That's a major change of job, isn't it? And so, of course, he's been anointed to be king. And so he's probably thinking to himself, I'm in the palace. The throne's just over there. Won't be too long now. Do you think he might have thought that? I'm sure he would have thought. I would have thought that. That's logical, yeah? I'm almost there. I've gone from success to success. And of course, he's pretty important in the army. After all, he's just slain Goliath. He's a champion. So he's a big deal in the army. And the army men all love him. They think he's great. And the people love him. The army comes home from dealing to the Philistines probably. And the women in the city sing, Saul has slain his thousands. And he had. He was a very effective king at dealing with the Philistines on the whole. But David has slain his tens of thousands. This is kind of the zenith, right? It doesn't get any better than this. The next step is the throne, the golden circlet round the head, and being in charge. And then it all goes pear-shaped. John Ortberg writes, David knew what it was to walk on water. He trusted God, and for a long time, everything he touched turned to gold. He was on his way to the palace. Then a strange thing happened. One by one, those wonderful things he'd been given were stripped away. He lost his job. Saul threw a javelin at him. He wasn't very popular anymore. He lost his wife, Saul's daughter, who he'd managed to get because of that interesting feat that he achieved for King Saul. I won't go into the details. It's really gruesome, but you can read about it in your Bible. It's a very gruesome book. That's why I must confess as a child I loved it so much. His mentor, Samuel, died, all right? This was the guy who had anointed him as king. If he's going to go and die on you, you start to think maybe the promise isn't going to come true. Maybe this is all going to turn pear-shaped. He loses his best friend, Jonathan, his brother-in-law. He loses him, and he never ever, at least as far as the Bible goes, never ever sees him again after they do that whole bow and arrow thing. And then he's been in charge in the army. The army's gone, and now he has a group of misfits that hang out with him. All the guys that owe money, who are in trouble, they all come to David. And he ends up in the hometown of his enemy. He ends up in Gath. From up here, success after success after success, to down here, where all the failure happens. That's where David is. He even plays the madman in order to save his neck. Because in those days you didn't kill mad people because they all thought you were touched with the divine if you were mad. So you had to be looked after. And finally he goes to the cave of Adullam and he writes a psalm, Psalm 142. And it goes like this. And as you think about where the trajectory of David's life, where he's been and now where he is, it makes complete and perfect sense. I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. I reckon like this. God, you've let me down. We were almost there. I could see the palace. I was in the palace. I could see the throne that you promised to me. It was within touching distance. And now it's all gone. And I'm miles away from the capital. I'm here in this cave of despair. Where are we up to? Verse 3. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watch over my way. In the path where I walk, people have hidden a snare for me. You know what a snare is, don't you? It's what you use to catch a rabbit. Yeah? Look and see, there is no one at my right hand. The right hand is the most important spot, right? That's where your most loyal supporter would sit. There is no one at my right hand. Well, David's inclined to exaggerate, yeah? I'm sure Joab was sitting there, his cousin, and he's a good man to have in a scrap. Yeah? No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for me. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me. That rotten King Saul, man, I really sweat blood for him, and look what he's doing to me now. For they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me, not like all these blokes I've got here at the moment, because of your goodness to me. And I exaggerate too, because all those blokes are listed in the book of Samuel as the 30 mighty men. And of course, we know the 30th one listed as Uriah the Hittite. David has sunk beneath the waves. His hand is barely making it above the waterline. His water-walking days seem to have been behind him. For years he's been on the run, and now he lives in a cave of Adullam, which, by the way, means hiding place. And who's he hiding from? He's hiding from King Saul, who does not have good intentions for him. Where's the promise? Where's the palace? It's okay to mourn your losses. It's all right to face your failures and recognize them and spend a bit of time moping. That's all right. But you can't stay there. There is still water to walk on. Jesus is waiting to rescue and walk with you there. Yes, swallow for a time, but then it's time to take action, and that is what Peter did very briefly, and that is what David did for a very long time. And they found God in the midst of their failure and disappointment. Jesus reached out his hand to Peter, and in time the promises of God for David were fulfilled. Did you know failure is not all bad? And it's hard to believe. It's pretty hard to believe when I got 16% on my exam in Form 3. My goodness gracious me. Ever sat in the class and worked out that you are the failure? It's not a nice feeling. I remember sitting down the back, because it was maths and me, we did not get on. And I actually really like maths now, but maths at high school was pretty hard. First year of high school, I was in 3B, not because of my maths mark, I can tell you that. And we had the same exam between 3A and 3B. And so there were 62 boys all sitting the same test, and I came 62nd. You don't come any further behind than that, right? So I'm sitting in the science lab, I think about 4 rows back, and Mr. Stead, who was probably the best maths teacher I ever had, was handing out the papers. And in those days, they like to make you feel ashamed, right, if you're or feel really good if you're at the top. So I'm sitting there in my chair, and I'm watching Mr. Stead with his big red hair and big red beard walking around handing out the papers, and I'm wondering, when am I getting mine? And I'm watching him go past Grant McCulloch, who's a vet now, and watching him go past all these very clever people. I'm thinking, when am I getting my paper? When will he get to my seat? And then finally, Mr. Stead makes his way towards me. And then I'm not looking at my score. I'm looking, where's he going to now? And why is he going back up the front? Then I look down at my score on my paper, and in bed, red ink. I really hate red ink. My dad was a real estate agent for a very long time. One day he had a teacher for a client. And he came home, he said, he's marked my agreement, because in New Zealand, the agents control the agreements, not like here in Australia. So if you sell your property, the agent will come to you with the offer which he's prepared, and you will sign it, and the deal is done. That's how it works, right? Or you won't, and the deal won't be done, and you'll negotiate backwards and forwards. Now, he'd taken the agreement to this teacher who was the vendor, and he showed it to me, and there was red circles everywhere. Well, I had red circles all over my maths test, and at the top there was a big red circle with the number 16% written in it. And I'm thinking, well, that's not a very good mark. And then Mr. Stead did a very nice thing. He said, some of you haven't done so well. I'm going, yeah, that's me. He said, I will be here on Tuesdays and Thursdays at lunchtimes. If you want to do better, you come and see me. So I was there, because I wasn't going to come last again. Thankfully, that never, ever happened again, which was really good. Anyway, I digress. This is the problem. You tell your story and you forget why you're telling it, don't you? But I guess that's an illustration of failure, isn't it? But failures don't last forever. You can get past them. All right. Oh, that's why I'm telling it. Saturday nights at our place, when I was Alexander's age, revolved around rugby. Now, if you talk to any Samoan worth his salt, he will tell you that when we all go to heaven, we will not be playing AFL. I hate to say this in South Australia. We will not be playing AFL. We will certainly not be playing rugby league, because that's not a very good game. We'll be playing rugby union. Now, for you people from South Australia, you probably don't know the difference, really, do you? You do? Well, this guy over here does. I know Matt does. All right. And all my Samoan friends say we'll play rugby union in heaven, because that's the game of heaven. Anyway, right. So on Saturday night, as soon as Sabbath was out, I would count to 10 very fast. 10, and then I would turn on the TV, and we would watch provincial rugby in New Zealand. And I'd watch Auckland play whoever or whatever it might be. And I always supported either North Auckland or Southland, because they were the two provinces that meant the most to me. Anyway, when the game would finish, the captains would get to speak, right? And they had the same talk as the AFL guys and the rugby league guys. I don't know how they do it, but they all say the same stuff, right? And so if you won, if you were the winning captain, you would say things like, well, it was a really good game. The opposition played really well. And they do all that sort of stuff, don't they? And, they tried really hard, and it was hard for us, but, we won by 30 points, whatever it might be, And so that was all good, and they would clap on the back. And then the losing captain would have to speak. Who would want to be the losing captain? They're trying to find some good in losing. There's never any good in losing, is there? Let's be honest. We all want to win. But inevitably they would say this line, there's a lot of learning we can take from this game. That's how it would go, right? People don't usually learn too much when it's all onwards and upwards. When the trajectory's this way, there's nothing to learn, because obviously you're doing it all right, aren't you? But when you lose, when the trajectory dips and starts to head down towards sea level, that's when you start to learn stuff. I don't know what David wrote Psalm 31, but the first verse of Psalm 31 says this: in you, Lord, I have, and I've highlighted it and underlined it, have taken refuge. We take refuge in God most enthusiastically when we are losing, when we are failing, when the team's not going so well. David took refuge in a cave. Even Jesus spent time in the cave. But it's from the cave that God resurrects dead things. In Dante's Divine Comedy, there is this phrase: abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Now, I know the phrase. I don't know Dante's Divine Comedy. I have to confess that I didn't read the classics. I'm presuming it's one of those. But I know that phrase. It's become a phrase that's well known in English. Apparently, according to the book, or the play, or whatever it is, see, I don't even know which it is, this is the phrase that was supposedly inscribed above the entrance to hell. And I could see how that would be a place where all hope would disappear, yeah? Now, as good Adventists, we don't really see hell as a place, do we? We see it more as an event, right, that takes place before Jesus recreates the world free from sin. You read about it at the end of Revelation. Nonetheless, I would imagine that if hell was a place, it would be a place where there wasn't too much hope. There's this other phrase that we know as well. While there is life, there is hope. We have a little dog at our house. Her name is Millie, and Millie is just over a year old. Her birthday she shares with my brother-in-law, so it's easy for us to remember what her birthday is, the 12th of June. Millie is a cavoodle. She's a Cavalier King Charles crossed with a toy poodle, and she is a delight. She is a lovely little dog. She's getting to the stage now where she barks at everything through the window, which annoys me immensely. But apart from that one little small problem, she is terrific. She's just really lovely. She's smart. She learns really fast. I've only taught her one thing, and that's to sit. And she does it with great alacrity. She's very good. But in the last 4 or 5 or 6 months, she's become what one would say is ball obsessed. Some dogs get that way, right? And so you're sitting in the lounge on the couch, and maybe you're watching television or reading a book or talking or whatever, doing something. And she will come up to you with her little small undersized tennis ball in her mouth, and she will drop it down in front of you, and then she flops down on her stomach with her paws out, and the ball is sort of roughly in here. And then she'll look at you like this until she's caught your eye, and then she'll nudge the ball towards you, and then she'll look at you again, and her eyes speak of hope. Yeah. Please, I know you can. I hope you will do something with the ball. Just knock it somewhere so I can chase it and get it. And I'll bring it back. I really will. And she does. I won't give it to you straight away, though, but I will give it back in time. Millie is the essence of hope. John Ortberg says that hope is the fuel that human hearts run on. I think it's what dogs' hearts run on as well. We can survive the loss of an extraordinary number of things, but no one can outlive hope. When it's gone, we are done. And we find ourselves in the state of learned helplessness. I won't tell you about that, but if you go online, you can look at you can read about an experiment they did with some dogs and electric shocks and learned helplessness. It's really quite interesting. Peter wasn't in that spot, though. He knew there was nothing more that he could do, but there was one last thing that could be done, and so he did it. As Peter sank down beneath the waves, he shouted, "Lord, save me." It wasn't "Lord, save me" like I used to read when I did the scripture. It was "Lord, save me. Help me." Peter still had hope in his extremity. They did a study of 122 men who had suffered their first heart attack. I'm quite interested in heart attacks, seeing as I had arrhythmia in my heart for 11 and a half hours a couple of years ago. And they were evaluated on their hopefulness versus their pessimism. And here we go, hopefulness versus pessimism. Pessimism, that's quite hard to say up the front when your lips starting to get a bit dry, aren't they? Anyway, it was interesting. After 8 years, 25 of the most pessimistic men were compared with 25 of the most optimistic men. And of the most pessimistic men, by 8 years after they'd had their first heart attack, 21 were dead. Among the optimistic men, only 6 of them were dead, of the most optimistic men. And so they said they determined that loss of hope increased the odds of death by more than 300%. Now, I'm not sure how you increase the odds of death because we're all going to die. A very interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? Nonetheless, obviously, after an 8-year period, there was 300% more likelihood if you were pessimistic that you would die after having one heart attack than if you were optimistic. And so they concluded that it was better to eat a Mars bar and hope than broccoli and despair. Which suits me because broccoli, you know how you have your favourite veggies? Broccoli isn't one of them for me. I eat it. I'll eat it with a little bit of lemon juice and a bit of olive oil, and not too well cooked. Remember when I was a child, they used to cook it till it was grey, right? Remember that? Maybe you younger ones don't remember that, but us older ones do. Remember, peas used to be sort of a browny colour sometimes, and they turned up on. I think, goodness gracious me. But broccoli, not too much cooked, still bright green with a little bit of olive oil and some lemon juice, is okay. It's better than Brussels sprouts. Don't like them at all. Anyway, better to eat a Mars bar in hope than eat broccoli in despair. And this appeals to me because I love chocolate. It's great stuff, right? Very nice. But when everything is going wrong and we feel unable, we need to have a source of hope that comes from beyond ourselves. Because in the end, our own hope tends to run out. At the end of Romans, where Paul gives a series of pieces of good advice, he writes this in Romans chapter 15 and verse 13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that, it's a very important little phrase, so that you may overflow with hope by the power, not of yourself, but of the Holy Spirit. God is the ultimate source of hope. That's why David cried out to him. That's why he called out in his cave of Adullam, the hiding place where he was finding refuge. That's why Peter shouted out, Lord, save me! And the God who never fails reached out his hand. He took David from the cave to the palace. He took Peter sinking in the water and walked with him side by side to the boat. And they got into the boat and peace reigned. Things will get better. There is always a reason to hope. And for Christians, the reason to hope is not inside ourselves, but it's outside ourselves in the person of God. John Ortberg tells a story of a woman who had been given 3 months to live. I always like these stories. Cancer, not very nice, but they always have a very good, moral at the end. Cancer was ravaging her body and death was coming. Her doctor told her to go home and prepare to die. There seemed no room for hope. Her pastor came to visit her and they talked about her funeral. That doesn't sound very hopeful, does it? And how it ought to be. They decided on the scriptures to be read and they decided on the hymns that would be heard and would be sung. And she told the pastor she wanted to be buried with her favourite Bible, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And just as he was about to leave, she weakly called out from her chair, "Just one more thing, Pastor." "What?" asked the pastor. "I want to be buried with my fork in my right hand." Now, you're looking as quizzical as I was as I read this story. Naturally, the pastor was confused too. He did not know what to say. She saw his confusion, and so she explained. In all my years of going to church functions, whenever food was involved, my favourite part was when whoever was cleaning up the dishes from the main course would lean over and say, "You can keep your fork." It was my favourite part because I knew that it meant something great was coming. It wasn't going to just be jelly. It was going to be cake. Isn't cake great? You see on those things on TV, they do those layered cakes in all the different colours. That really appeals. All the cream, that really appeals to me. I'm only able to have small pieces though, it's very sad. or pie. One thing about South Australia is the pies down here are excellent. They do bakeries very good in South Australia. I like going to bakeries. There's a really nice bakery. I won't go there. All right. Something of substance, something that needed a fork, not just jelly. So I just want people to see me there in my casket with my fork in my hand, and I want them to wonder, what's with the fork? Then I want you to tell them, something better is coming. Keep your fork. And he did. Romans chapter 5 and verses 3 to 5 says, and not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Now hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given to us. We all go through hard times. We all spend time sinking in the water. We all do time in the cave of failure and disappointment. But we persevere. Character is formed and developed. And we hope because God pours out his love in our hearts. And when God's love is in our hearts, we most certainly can have hope. Hope for now in our difficulties. Hope for what lies in the future. And hope in the great future beyond that God has prepared. The good news, which is loaded with hope, is this: the cave is not the end. So keep a hold of your fork.